You watch an animal mature from egg to animal and go, whoa, that's a hell of an algorithm that generated that thing. You go back to the very beginning, like, what was the algorithm in that egg? The very rough version of my argument is if you step back and look at the history of life on Earth in time lapse, it actually looks more than you might think like the development of a single organism, as if we are building a planetary superorganism.
I looked through your book, Why Buddhism is True, and I found it very interesting what you say about perception.
When we perceive the world, we impose all these essences on things. Friend, enemy, good person, bad person. Meditation can erode some of these cognitive biases. And I think AI really crystallizes the challenge.
What would you, as an academic, maybe recommend that these big superpowers do about AI?
Well, first of all, I would say
This is the Loaf Podcast. Welcome back to the bakery, everyone, where we break bread with the world's finest. Today, we're sat down with Robert Wright, best-selling author specializing in evolutionary psychology, and he's the founder of multiple online forums for discussion, such as bloggingheads.tv. He's the founder of the Nonzero newsletter, which is on Substack. Robert, or Bob, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Bob, it's great to have you here. Would you be able to maybe give us a little bit of an in-depth description of yourself for our listeners and what you kind of specialize in?
Which aspect would you like me to focus on? I mean, I've written about a lot of different things, I guess. I am, by profession, I'm just a journalist. I have taught at the college level here at Princeton and at Penn by virtue of some of the books I've written, but I'm not actually a credentialed academic. I have written about evolutionary psychology in a book called The Moral Animal, which goes way back to the kind of when the term evolutionary psychology was just coming into circulation. A book called Nonzero about the history of the world and also of life. Book called The Evolution of God, about the development of, in particular, the Abrahamic God. A book called Why Buddhism is True, which is sounds kind of more conceited or presumptuous than I like to think it is. It focuses on the kind of the naturalistic, or some would say secular, part of Buddhism, and I defend kind of the philosophical and psychological principles that rests on. My first book actually was called Three Scientists and Their Gods, and that would take a while to explain. But the worldview in that, I'm kind of getting back to in a book I'm writing now about artificial intelligence. And I don't know what else. I mean, I've written for a lot of places, magazines, as we used to call them. And as you said, I now write for my newsletter, Nonzero newsletters. There's a Nonzero podcast, which is what Blogging Heads has kind of evolved into. You mentioned Blogging Heads. What other, I don't know.
That's
horoscope sign. What do you want to know?
No, that's a great introduction. But you mentioned one more thing we want to know. Basically, with the Loaf Podcast, so we see food, bread as really kind of the basics of our human condition, the essence. We're wondering what your favorite bread is as someone who promotes Buddhism.
Well, when I was a kid, I used to like to take Wonder Bread. Do you know what that is? It's like the whitest. It's like the ad slogan was "Helps build strong bodies in 12 ways," but it's probably the least nutritious bread you could conceive of. It was just white, soft bread, and I would roll it up into little dense balls and put it in my mouth. And, honestly, I don't think I've ever enjoyed any bread more than I enjoyed that. So I'm going to go with Wonder Bread.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. I just wanted to drop you in a word from our sponsor, Manscaped. You can use the discount code LOAF to get your discount, because even a lion needs to tame its mane.
Get the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra from Manscaped now. Stay fresh with no cuts, so that your baguette leaves no crumbs.
It's good. American, right? That's probably why we haven't heard of it.
You might say, yes.
Okay. So with that important question out of the way, let's get on to something a little bit less serious, which is morality and evolution. So I do philosophy. So I'm particularly interested in your writings in The Moral Animal. So I wanted, just for our listeners, before we get into a bit of discussion about the key points, could you just explain both the genesis and what you see as the nature of human morality as it relates to evolution? So why it comes about and what sorts of things are at the base of it that structure our morality?
Well, I think that you can't really understand human morality and human moral impulses and intuitions without understanding the dynamics of human evolution. One of the courses I actually taught here at Princeton was I co-taught a graduate seminar with Peter Singer. I'm sure you're familiar with him, called The Nature of Ethics. It was about the biological basis of moral intuition. We were exploring that question. And I think that, some kind of theoretical developments in evolutionary biology that took place in the 60s and 70s, some kind of theoretical refinements of the basic theory of natural selection, you might say, many of which they're kind of covered in Richard Dawkins's book, The Selfish Gene, although he didn't apply them to human beings much in that book. But I think when you think about how those things do apply to the evolution of human psychology, you can understand our moral intuitions, and for that matter, the whole human predicament a lot more clearly.
It's interesting you bring up Peter Singer, actually, and you said, I'm sure you know him, because we hosted him in Oxford for an episode. And interestingly, we actually got a little bit into evolutionary biology as it relates to morality, because his argument for, and I just wanted to see what you might think about this, his argument for universal or objective moral values was precisely that evolution can't account for what we call universal benevolence. So not just benevolence towards our tribe, people who look like us, think like us, or on our team, but sort of this seemingly universal moral idea which comes about in all societies, that we should promote good for people, happiness, fulfillment, etc., and not suffering. And that this idea of universal benevolence, having it for everyone, not being able to be explained by evolution, might be something more like the recognition of an objective moral value.
Yeah, he wrote a book called The Expanding Circle a long time ago about the fact that, whereas I think he put it this way, this was one of his examples, but there was a time when members of one ancient Greek city-state, well, they didn't call it ancient back then, of course, but when one Greek city-state would consider people in another Greek city-state subhuman, enslave them, kill them. And then they had this moral epiphany and decided that all Greeks are humans. It's just the Persians who aren't humans, and so on. In fact, supposedly Aristotle counseled Alexander the Great, whom he tutored as a child, to treat Greeks as though they were kin, but non-Greeks as though they were, quote, plants or animals. That was in, I think, Plutarch's biography of Alexander the Great. And as Peter points out, now in the modern world, we at least feel you should say that people of all races, creeds, and colors deserve to be treated decently and have basic rights. Of course, we sometimes honor that in the breach and don't really comply with it, but at least it's something that is said, and that's an advance. And sometimes we do comply with it and try to comply with it. And so, anyway, Peter. It's funny. Peter has one explanation for that expansion of the moral circle in that book, and I think there's some truth to that. And I have a different and possibly complementary one in my book, Nonzero. What I emphasize is that as human social evolution has proceeded, and cultural evolution, kind of since hunter-gatherer days, people have found themselves in non-zero-sum relationships with more and more people at greater and greater distances. And that, as a practical matter, when you're interdependent with someone, when you're playing a possible win-win game with them, whether because of economic exchange or you have some other common interest, or maybe you're uniting with them against some common enemy, all those things encourage you to treat them decently. And I think that's part of the dynamic, is the expansion of non-zero-sum dynamics that have kind of culminated in globalization. And if all goes well, will further culminate in the development of a true global community, which is, I think, urgently needed right now and hasn't really happened. Peter's explanation in the expanding circle is more about our kind of having an intuition that, and I, repeat this at great peril because I'll probably get it wrong, but the idea is that evolution does give us a kind of a tit for tat instinct that, good deeds should be punished, bad deeds should be rewarded, that you have to justify the bad things you want to do to other people or the good things you want for yourself through some kind of argument about what is more generally deserved. I think he, as I recall, says we do begin with that kind of core intuition, but we don't naturally apply it, say, beyond the village or beyond the tribe or whatever, and that's what takes work. And he would stress the intellectual work, the sheer, application of reason to the basic core instinct. But anyway, for whatever reason, this has happened. And, I guess in general, the good news about human evolution is it left us with instincts and impulses that, although designed to be used sometimes at the expense of others and in the service of our own, genetic proliferation, at least as that imperative was defined during evolution, that these impulses and instincts we can build on, sometimes by just using reason to come closer to something that deserves the term moral truth.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I suppose it is when we get to this level quite specific, and the specificities are complex, nuanced, and maybe it's a bit difficult to tell. I think even Peter acknowledged that to a certain extent. Well, we can't really know for sure. We need certain evidence, and I was wondering maybe for a more general audience who might not be familiar with evolutionary psychology as it relates to morality, I was maybe wondering through your books and through your work throughout the last few years, what your really core beliefs are in relation to morality and how we can use evolutionary psychology to learn something about the way we should live our lives, or the kind of values that we have in modern society.
Well, I guess to some extent a utilitarian like Peter, and that just means that, roughly speaking, you think that the goal of a moral system and the goal of one's behavior that one is going to consider moral should be to maximize the welfare of humankind, sometimes put as the greatest good for the greatest number or something. All these are rough approximations of the way it would be put precisely. But the basic idea is that, it seems to me like the easiest approach to morality to justify the idea. We all pretty much agree that having a sense of well-being, being happy, these are good things. So it'd be nice to maximize them. And then you add the assumption that no one person is special, so that everyone's happiness counts equally in the moral calculus. And then you're pretty much to utilitarianism. I think most other moral systems involve more in the way of assumptions, but I guess you could loosely say I adhere to a version of utilitarianism, not exactly like Peter's. I think one thing is a core belief is that moral principles should apply equally to everyone. That's part of utilitarianism, not the only part, and it's part of a lot of moral systems. But I think one thing evolutionary psychology teaches is how hard that is to realize and how naturally biased we all are towards ourselves and our groups, and how subtly the biases work. I think that is still not fully appreciated, is how hard these biases are to root out. And that's kind of a preoccupation of mine right now, is trying to figure out a way to encourage us all to do more work on that front.
Mm-hmm. So I want to check with you before I advance the discussion that it's this kind of the view you still hold, but in an article on Joshua Green, you describe a thought experiment. Everyone's probably heard of the thought experiment, the trolley experiment, whereby there's a train or a tram or something headed on its way to kill 5 people. And if you pull the lever, then you'll be changing the course and thereby killing the one person who's on the other side. And what was found in the experiment was that the people who chose to kill the one person, which on a utilitarian calculation is the right thing to do, versus let the 5 people die, were using the reason part of their brain more than perhaps the emotional. And you think that's a reason that we should be supporting utilitarianism. I just want to check that that's still the sort of view you hold.
Well, you mean because it seems to be more a product of pure reason than some alternative moral intuitions?
Yeah.
I guess that works in its favor. It's not the entire justification for it. Yeah, but I think, when you see our emotions playing a big role in a moral decision, there's reason to be skeptical about the wisdom of the decision. That's not always true, but it's, I think moral behavior should be subject to rational inspection and should pass the test. But you're right, that's a classic utilitarian thought experiment. And a good example of how kind of quirky human intuition is, at least from a utilitarian's point of view, is if you set the experiment up so that you pull the lever and divert the train from the one person it's going to, or from the 5 people it's going to kill to the one person, a lot of people say, yeah, you should do that. But if you say, okay, suppose the one person you wind up killing is actually up on a platform above the track and the train is headed for the 5 people. And what you do is you push that person onto the track and that slows the train just enough so that it doesn't hit the people. You're still trading off 5 for 1, but a lot of people say, no, not that. You shouldn't do that. And that's just, you can kind of see why that would be given the way human moral intuition evolved. But it's an example of the fact that we weren't designed to be utilitarian philosophers by natural selection.
I suppose the reason I ask is to take it one step further and to sort of ask, given that you're utilitarian, in what things should we ground our morality at base? Because obviously the rational part of the brain is being used more, as you cited in the study, when people are choosing to kill the one. This is in the case of the lever, but there's ultimately still a value at base which drives that reason, because it's calculating towards an end goal, which is to maximize pleasure. And at that point of choosing the value there, how do you think it's just an inbuilt of human psychology, or how do you think we justify that value which sits at the bottom of the reasoning?
Any moral system other than nihilism has to begin with the assertion of some value. This is something that, like, Sam Harris didn't get in he wrote this book, The Moral Landscape, kind of like not understanding why everybody didn't just automatically see why, he said like science had proved that something like utilitarianism was right. I mean, that's just very naive. You have to, he didn't pause to acknowledge that you have to begin with a value. Utilitarianism begins with the value assertion that human happiness or well-being or however you want to put it, is a moral good. And I'm just saying, I think that's assuming, and then you also assume nobody's special, all people are equally important. And I'm just saying, I think that's the least you have to assume of all moral systems that I'm aware of, or it's kind of the most plausible and simple set of assumptions.
Yeah. So the reason I think, and I agree with you. But I think then that creates a problem for the idea, which you don't, fully assent to, but that you talk about in your article, of utilitarianism being able to function as a kind of universal moral currency, because, like you say, which is true, it has the least assumptions and it's perhaps at base, from a neutral viewpoint, the most reasonable. But in order for it, because there's that value at the base, I feel like there is a problem with it functioning as a universal currency, just because, let's say you're Muslim, for example, and you have certain metaphysical beliefs which would prevent you from having a utilitarian view on morality. How do you square that in creating what you called, for example, like the Esperanto of morality?
Well, I was using that term mockingly in that review of Josh Green's book, and I really like Josh. Peter and I had Josh come talk to our class when we taught that class at Princeton, and so he wrote a book called, what was it? I think it had the tribe in the title. But anyway, I was arguing against his argument that the way to solve a lot of the conflict in the world was to get everyone on the same, using the same moral system, in particular utilitarianism. He was arguing that that would help. I'd be fine with doing that, spreading, making utilitarianism universally subscribed to, but I don't think it's going to solve our problems. And that was my point. Esperanto, as a lot of people, I think, no longer know, it's kind of a boomer thing maybe, but it was an attempt to create a universal human language. There, the idea was that the source of conflict was that we all speak different languages. And if only there was just one language, and somebody invented it, and it was called Esperanto, and there are people who actually learned it, then everything would be fine. And I was saying, Josh is kind of, for him, utilitarianism is the moral equivalent of Esperanto. He thinks if only we were on the same page, our problems would be solved. And I'm like, no. And the reason is, what I get back to is that, there are lots of cases where we all accept the same principle, but we disagree about its application. And Hamas and Israel are a good example. They both would say a lot of the same things, like you're not allowed, you shouldn't like start a fight. You shouldn't be the first to aggress. They just disagree about, if you go back into history, who the initial aggressor was. And there are a lot of things like that in life. I mean, I think with most wars, there isn't an explicit disagreement on moral principle. It's like, Ukraine and Russia, Russia has its set of grievances. It says, NATO was threatening it. And we say, no, we didn't mean to threaten you. So it's a disagreement about the facts. And Russia says it was preemptive in the way your invasion of Iraq was. And we say, no, that's different. But we're not disagreeing that preemptive self-defense can be valid. So I think if we really want to solve the world's great conflicts, we need to get at those biases that convince us that our group is in the right. It isn't a question of which moral system is being used.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I looked through your book, Why Buddhism is True, and I watched your video at Google about it, and I found it very interesting what you say about perception. So the concept of your, well, I wouldn't say maybe spiritual enlightenment, but a spiritual experience perhaps, where you meditated and walked through the forest perhaps, and you saw a weed, and the weed which you might have once seen as invasive in your garden, now you see as, in this experience, after this meditation, after this mindfulness, you see as just another part of nature, just as a flower might be, just as beautiful and made up of the same atoms, so to speak, and there's no real difference in value. And I was wondering, is then perhaps, if it's not utilitarianism, is this maybe applying mindfulness meditation and really trying to get this third perspective on ourselves, perhaps, one way in which we can start to make a difference in the world? And how would you perhaps apply meditation to the current problems? Is it enough? Because sorry for going off on a tangent here, but a lot of people might say that it's a bit naive to say, oh yeah, Israel Hamas conflict, all you've got to do is meditate. I'm wondering, like, how you see this as maybe a pragmatic or practicable solution here.
Yeah, well, I certainly wouldn't say that at this point all they have to do is meditate. I do think that if more people meditated in a certain tradition and tried to apply the fruits of the meditation, there would be less conflict in the world. And maybe if both groups had been doing it all along, intensively, maybe we wouldn't be where we are. But let me elaborate on that particular experience. So you're right that I'm walking through the forest. It's at my first meditation retreat, and I see this weed that I'd always thought of as an enemy, and I think, weed is really just an arbitrary designation. It's not inherently uglier than the other plants. Now, that sounds like a trivial observation. obviously, it doesn't say weed in the DNA of the plant. Obviously, weed is a human designation. But what's interesting is how deeply this infiltrates your perception. So it was really, it's like you had to be there. You had to have the experience to understand how completely transformed your very perception of the weed is, because what I would call essence of weed had dropped out of it. Okay. And this is actually related to a Buddhist principle known as emptiness. The idea that, which could be put as the idea that when we perceive the world, we impose all these essences on things. And those show up in the form of very subtle feelings, most dramatically, like friend, enemy, good person, bad person. Those more than we realize, even with those obvious cases, I think those seeing people in one of those two categories gives you a kind of feeling that then shapes the way you think about those people. And this happens at much subtler levels. There's an essence of my car, and it's different from the essence of other cars. It's a subtle feeling I get when I look at my car. I do think, I certainly haven't attained enlightenment in the Buddhist sense, but I've gone on enough retreats that I've gotten closer to that than I am in my ordinary waking life. And yes, part of that would be looking at people, and you do get a feeling for this. You can at a retreat without bringing to the perception all the baggage that's associated with the category you've put them in, which fundamentally just corrupts your thinking about them. I would say, look, meditation can erode some of these cognitive biases. It is a real uphill struggle, in the sense that on day 5 of a meditation retreat, you may be in a very different place from where you normally are, and you may be like, Gandhi level, whatever. But then you go back into the real world, and it's kind of hard to, it's going to be, in my experience, impossible to sustain that particular frame of mind, and hanging on to even some of it requires daily practice. So it's not, for most of us, a miracle cure, but at the same time, the value of a retreat for me is to give you real insight into how subtle and stubborn these biases are, to give you a sense for how transformed you would have to be completely free of them. And, maybe to give you the determination to work against them. But I'm convinced that either humankind wakes up and really grapples with this problem, and it is getting more attention. The term cognitive biases, you never heard this 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's good that people have at least heard the term. They still, I don't think, are necessarily focusing on the right biases or really grappling with the biases, but it's progress. But in any event, I think if we don't make a lot more progress, we're toast. And at least in the sense of chaos, mass suffering. And I think AI really crystallizes the challenge. There is no way we are going to wisely usher ourselves into the next phase of technological evolution if we don't get over all the international conflicts and a lot of the domestic conflicts. You cannot wisely regulate AI at the merely national level. There's going to have to be some degree of international coordination, at least normative coordination, at very, very minimum. And the U.S. right now is not in the kind of domestic. It doesn't have the kind of domestic cohesion you'd have to do a good job at the level of national legislation.
AI is, at least in my opinion, Ollie might disagree with me, for me, something that we should be worried about. What would you, as an academic, maybe recommend that these big superpowers do about AI? Because obviously, no one can know for sure where it's going to go. You don't want China to take the lead necessarily. What would you recommend?
Well, first of all, I would say, I think in a way too much emphasis is being put on the sci-fi superintelligence,
Sure.
AI chooses to squash us all scenario. Sure. I'm agnostic on it's not impossible in the distant future, but I think they're much more near term. threats, just sheer destabilization, you add the effect on the job market to the things that bad actors can do with it, to the unforeseeable, in a way, consequences of people just coming to rely on AIs for personal companionship, counseling, guidance. I mean, in some cases that'll be good, but as our experience with social media shows us, never assume that algorithms emanating from capitalism are going to be pure good. So I would say, first of all, if we could just slow things down a little, that would be great, because it would give us more time to adjust, adapt, figure out what we need to do. And it's, as you alluded to, it's actually very hard to slow things down so long as you're worried about what's going on in China. Like any arms race dynamic, whether among corporations, unregulated among corporations, or between nations, is going to make it very hard to legislate any kind of slowdown. I'll give you an example. One thing I think some reasonable people are saying is that, okay, already some of the, pretty advanced models have gone open source. And that's okay for now. We're learning a lot. But if you look at the next generation, the kind of GPT-5 or whatever, we might want to think about making sure that those aren't open source, which would mean legislation saying that what Facebook has done is no longer legal. But again, that has to be international legislation, or you're not going to get it done. There has to be some degree of international regulation. That sounds hopeless right now. But why does it sound hopeless? Because we're in a Cold War with China that didn't have to happen. It's not in our interest. It's not in China's interest. It just happened. What's happening in Russia, in Ukraine, isn't good for Russia, isn't good for Ukraine. They're dying in extremely large numbers. This is true of these conflicts generally. They're not like someone winning a zero-sum game. They're two parties losing a non-zero-sum game. That means it's like not rational. We shouldn't be proud of it. And if we don't get better at heading these things off, I don't think we can handle the AI challenge. The last thing I say is, at a minimum, when you hear someone say, "Oh, we can't do this because that will stifle innovation in AI," that's not a good objection. Stifling innovation just may be a feature and not a bug, okay? Slower is probably better. Things are moving very fast, and I think people are starting to wake up to that. I think they're going to be a lot more awakened within a year or two.
Just because we're using the concept quite a lot, and also because it links back to AI here in terms of constantly developing complexity and sophistication, would you mind just quickly explaining for our listeners the concept of the non-zero sum game, and then how you apply that to deterministic progress and evolution with humans?
Yeah. So, a zero-sum game is one in which not just is there a winner or a loser, but like everything in the game is good for one player exactly to the extent that it's bad for the other. So if you're playing tennis, the outcome of every exchange is good by 1 point for one side and bad by 1 point for the other. Now, if you're playing doubles tennis, your relationship to the person on your side of the net is entirely non-zero sum. Every point is either good for both of you or bad for both of you. That's a purely like non-zero sum game. In real life, most relationships are combinations of non-zero sum and zero sum. You and a friend help each other out in certain contexts, but you have a crush on the same, love interest or something. You may, or you want the same position on the basketball team or whatever. There are elements of rivalry. That's zero sum. Only one person is going to get that position on the basketball team. So, or with bargaining, like, okay, if you buy a car, it means that you would rather have the car than the money you paid. The merchant would rather have the money than the car. That's not zero sum. But before you get the car, there's a bargaining phase where, somewhere between the most you're willing to pay and the least the dealer is willing to accept, between those two things, it's entirely zero sum, the bargaining. So anyway, life is a combination of non-zero sum and zero sum. The argument in my book, Nonzero, was that you can describe both biological evolution and human cultural evolution, by which I mean the evolution of everything that's not genes in a way. I mean, music, religion, law, science, all information transmitted by humans that's non-genetic. Both of these kinds of evolution, and of course cultural evolution, has entailed this growth in the complexity of social structure, the depth and scope, and that's why we have a globalized society. And I argue you can analyze both. If you ask why did biological evolution create more and more complex organisms until you finally had one that was smart enough to launch cultural evolution, and then why did cultural evolution have the kind of direction it had, toward the growth of more complex social structure? You can really describe both of them as, kind of growth in the expanse of non-zero sum relationships, although driven often by zero sum dynamics. And I think more and more over time in evolution, the importance of kind of non-zero sum relationships has become recognized. And to get back to the very beginning of the conversation, one of the, I think, important lessons of evolutionary psychology is that the human brain is designed to navigate a landscape of zero sum and non-zero sum relationships. That's what a hunter-gatherer society has. And that really accounts for a lot of our psychology, including our moral psychology, our cognitive biases, the intuition that good deeds should be rewarded and bad deeds should be punished. And that's not just an intuition of like vengeance. I want my vengeance. It's a more refined sense that if you just hear about a case where somebody was assaulted, and then you hear that the person who assaulted them was caught and punished, you kind of feel better because you have this intuition that's a good thing. So all of these things, I think you can only understand both the promise of human psychology and the great things about it and the downside of it by understanding that it was designed to play zero sum and non-zero sum games. And that the kind we play today are not the same kind we were playing when it was designed. Like there weren't nuclear bombs then, for example.
So correct me if I'm wrong before I move it onto AI, but essentially there's a favoring overall and a movement in the direction of almost or perhaps deterministically towards non-zero sum, as in benefit for everyone, and therefore towards increasing complexity and sophistication on both sides. And that's what kind of leads to the intelligence and development of humans.
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, as far as cultural social evolution goes, the driver of the growth in social complexity, in the depth and expanse of social complexity, is that new technologies come along that either facilitate or otherwise encourage the playing of non-zero sum games involving more and more people at greater distances. Although a lot of that is driven by zero sum competition among groups, basically zero sum competition, even though strictly speaking, it rarely is purely that. And that, in evolution, in a certain sense, yes. I mean, the development of a complex organism is the development through evolution of an organism whose various cells are playing a kind of non-zero sum game with one another to win-win, outcome. It's a classic case of like they're all in the same vehicle, they will thrive together or perish together. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that. Cells die and so on. And in a certain sense, strictly speaking, it's more like the information embedded in the DNA is it's like the non-zero sum game is kind of being played at that level. The ultimate winner is the pattern of information in the DNA, but that is incarnated in. But the way it wins is by orchestrating cooperative behavior among a whole bunch of cells containing it. I don't know. Maybe we're probably getting a little too.
That makes sense.
No. Well, yeah, I mean, we're not scientists, but as in us, as in Lucas and I. But
Neither am I, but
the reason I was going to link it back was to ask, you know, in the vein of increasing complexity and sophistication, whether you think there's a sort of non-zero sum possibility with the future of AI where there can be a positive symbiotic relationship for all or most people as it develops, or whether you think with the current development it's more.
You mean a
likely
relationship between humankind and AI, or among people?
Yeah, well, I don't say relationship to mean among people. Like with AI facilitating. I don't mean to suggest that there's like some sort of personal relationship between AI and humans, but.
But I think in a way that the largest goal is to make sure that there's. I mean, if you take the sci-fi superintelligence doomer scenario seriously, the goal, it seems to me, I mean, some people who take that seriously just want to like bomb the chip factories and stop the progress, and that seems to me like beyond hopeless. Actually stopping it, but I do think. The goal, if that's a serious concern, the way to address it is to try to make sure that there remains a symbiotic relationship between the AI and humankind. In other words, they always need us. And because we're going to need them. I mean, we are becoming more reliant on AI. And I'm not even assuming that AI is sentient, has subjective experience, consciousness. I don't know. I'm agnostic on whether it will or does or whatever, but just in terms of reconciling the continued proliferation of AI with the continued proliferation and well-being of humankind, you know, another way to say that is we want to play a non-zero-sum game with the AI to a win-win outcome. We want there to be a symbiotic relationship and not a fundamentally, well, strictly speaking, I think you'd call it a mutualistic relationship, but not a parasitic relationship where it just exploits us or like wipes us out. So but sure, certainly a non-zero sum win-win relationship among human beings should be part of that as well. Yeah,
sure. And forgive my relative ignorance on the matter of evolution. I think maybe a lot of the listeners too won't really know, but as far as I understand, evolution takes many hundreds, thousands of years to take effect. But and this is a bit of a sci-fi scenario that I'm taking it to. If AI were to get kind of complex enough and developed enough to almost resemble humans, and humans could start forming relationships with AI, a la Blade Runner, Her, that kind of thing, could that potentially affect human evolution in a very kind of sci-fi-ish way, where in 1,000, 2,000 years we could see humans and robots becoming slightly more symbiotic, very almost physically and structurally?
Well, I think technological evolution is moving so much faster than old-fashioned biological evolution that I wouldn't expect a lot on that front. But of course, one thing people think AI may do is accelerate progress in biotechnology, including genetic engineering. So you could find people choosing to alter their genetic makeup, possibly in ways that make them more content with living in a metaverse and having these like virtual reality relationships with a bunch of beings that aren't actually real, or a combination of beings that aren't real and the avatars of friends of theirs. Sorry to jump in. I mean, honestly,
No, I was just going to say, because Peter Singer, when I spoke to him, and when Ollie and I spoke to him, he said it would be, if possible, probably more preferable if everyone was in a matrix, for example, where it would be a very hypothetical matrix where everyone has the maximum happiness within that matrix and there's the least amount of suffering. So from that side, I'm not sure if you would agree or disagree.
Well, I mean, I guess in principle, I think everyone should have the opportunity to experience whatever forms of joy and pleasure there are. I take the metaverse thing seriously. I mean, I think, Zuckerberg, he got kind of mocked for renaming his company Meta, but I just think he kind of took the wrong approach and was maybe a few years early. But if you buy the idea that there aren't going to be many jobs for actual human beings to do, and I don't know whether that's the case, but you can't rule it out, and ask, well, how are people going to spend their time? It's possible that virtual forms of experience will become so compelling that that'll be a common choice. I mean, I've always thought that the path to the Matrix is, and by the way, little known trivia fact is that they gave Keanu Reeves 3 books to read for that role. One of them was The Moral Animal. I'm not convinced he read it, but God bless the directors for at least trying to get him to read it.
Wow.
And also Kevin Kelly's book, I think it was Out of Control, and then some French philosopher.
Baudelaire, maybe.
Exactly, yes. Well, I think, did he write whatever Simulacrum and Simula whatever?
Exactly. That's
Yeah,
the one.
that wasn't Baudelaire, but
Yeah. No, right. No, not Baudelaire. No, it was a contemporary. It was a French philosopher who then complained, about their use of it. And it's like they showed it on the bookshelf. I'm like, dude, do you not understand effective promotion? It's like just like, they're doing you a huge favor. But he complained anyway. I've always thought that the path to the Matrix leads through Wall-E, you might say, if you know that movie. It's a movie about self-indulgence in the world of the future. But I think if we do wind up, and this is decades from now, of course, if not centuries, but if we do wind up in a world fundamentally run by machines and people are spending their time in a dream world, they'll probably have gone there voluntarily, like via video games that are increasingly realistic.
I just want to throw it back to your discussion about evolution and kind of the deterministic aspect of it, because there's something I wasn't entirely clear on. And I read a little review from Steven Pinker on your book, Nonzero, The Logic of Human Destiny. And in your book, you basically argue that effectively, because of non-zero sum relationships, we are slowly moving towards increasing complexity, sophistication, processing information, which we've already said. But the criticism from Steven Pinker is that ultimately the function of evolution is for genes to be reproduced, and that were the environment not structured in such a way that intelligence were to increase this likelihood of carrying on with offspring, then intelligence wouldn't have arisen. And so there's not this deterministic relationship. I don't know how you would respond to that.
Well, I mean, I've talked to Peter. I'm not sure what he's trying to say there. There's certainly nothing you've said that I disagree with about why intelligence evolves. There's, at the end of the book, I think his big sticking point, at the end of the book, I argue that it's conceivable that natural selection serves an overarching purpose. I mean, so some ways that could happen is like, A, there could be a God that set it in motion. B, we could be living in a simulation and it's just this algorithm that somebody invented. C, extraterrestrials could have planted the seed of life with the idea that evolution would happen. But the main point is that none of those scenarios involve anything spooky or weird. I'm just talking about straightforward Darwinian material evolution. And I think for a while, Steve didn't understand that. And he used to get kind of triggered. Steve, as I've told him to his face, gets basically triggered by a discussion of that particular philosophical issue, the possibility that there is some kind of larger purpose to which natural selection is subordinate. That's the only fundamental critique of his of non-zero that I recall, and I can imagine him pointing out that we have a straightforward Darwinian explanation of the evolution of intelligence, and thinking that that's a refutation of the purpose hypothesis. but it's not. It's a common thing to say in response to it, but with all due respect to everyone who says it, it just shows they don't understand what I'm saying, which may be my fault, but it is of course evolution is a physical material process that happened through Darwinian mechanisms. I'm not saying anything beyond that. I'm just saying that could, there are physical processes that serve larger purposes, just the way when we design a computer program, it's actually a purely physical process involving electrons that signify information. But it has a purpose. We set it up and it unfolds and has a purpose.
Yeah. I suppose just to make myself clear in case we're misunderstanding each other, I think I might have put it slightly wrong. The point being is that in the book, you argue sort of that there's not inevitability, but let's use that word for the moment, an inevitability towards the development of greater sophistication and intelligence. And my argument purely was that if the environment didn't support greater intelligence, say, for example, in the ocean, where evolution has never led that way, or it has.
Well,
with dolphins
actually,
or whatever,
there's some pretty smart oceanic animals.
Yeah,
but
the point is, if the environment weren't to support those, then it wouldn't come about. And that's a critique of the idea of the inevitability of intelligence is sort of my point, rather than as it relates to.
Yeah, I never used the word inevitable. I said I did think that given enough time, intelligence of a human level was likely to evolve. That doesn't mean it was going to be in animals that looked exactly like us. It's certainly not deterministic at that level, which is something that Stephen Jay Gould used to not understand when he critiqued these kinds of arguments. But all I've said is I think it's highly likely. That's a contentious issue. There are great evolutionary biologists like the late William Hamilton who agree with me on that. And there are great evolutionary biologists like the late John Maynard Smith who disagree. But it's not a crazy thing to look at the evidence and say, I think given as long as life could persist on this planet, the eventual evolution of human level intelligence, and therefore the launching of a kind of cultural evolution was very likely. It's not a crazy claim. And as you can imagine, that is relevant to the purpose argument. If it wasn't at all likely, if it was just a total fluke, that weakens the argument that there's a purpose unfolding.
Of course, I mean, intelligence, you might maybe agree, could manifest itself in different ways, or do you necessarily think of it in let's say, the lens of human intelligence? Because, for example, couldn't the environment have let us evolve in that, for example, or sensory kinds of intelligence or sensory just abilities were far more heightened, for example, rather than our brain intelligence?
Well, I think the key thing is that it has to be an intelligence that starts creating technologies that then increasingly kind of assume the adaptive burden, so to speak, okay, and serve the interests of the organism. And so, I mean, for purposes of the argument about, was this planet likely to get to the point we seem to be at of kind of a global technological infrastructure, the key question is, would you get the kind of intelligence that launches technological evolution? And I think that kind of intelligence was fairly likely. It's a very conjectural thing to say that. I mean, it's not easy to wrap your mind around the probabilities.
I just want to return to the not design, but the purpose, because I know you don't assent to design theory, but the kind of purpose argument, you suggested possibilities of purpose. So, for example, simulation or extraterrestrials. But I wanted to ask at this point, because I think you have maybe shifted about a bit over the years. At this point, would you assent to the fact that there is likely a purpose in evolution? And if so, how would you go about justifying that?
Well, it's a slightly long argument, but if you Google higher purpose, my name, New York Times, evolution, you'll get to an article where I talk about it, and that links at the bottom to a larger argument I've made about it. What I would say, that's on the meaningoflife.tv URL, I think, but isn't accessible through that in an obvious way. What I would say now, the very rough version of the argument is, in Richard Dawkins's book, The Blind Watchmaker, he kind of, the title of the book comes from this theologian of, I think, the 18th century who argued that God must have created animals because they were kind of obviously the products of design. He said, if you're walking through a field and you see a rock, well, that's just a rock. It's not obviously a product of design. You see a watch, a pocket watch, and pick it up. Well, that's obviously has a purpose, right? I mean, intricately interconnected stuff. And what Dawkins says correctly is that he wasn't wrong. Paley, this theologian, wasn't wrong to distinguish between these two kinds of things and say, yeah, you can look at one and say, that must have a special kind of explanation. And Paley wasn't wrong to say animals and plants are in that category. They do demand a special kind of explanation because, they do seem to have, in some sense, a purpose. They seem designed to do something. They mature toward this kind of state of being this coherent, complex, interconnected thing. What Paley got wrong was the designer. It wasn't a God that designed them hands-on. It was natural selection. And Dawkins is he's right about all that. We now know the purpose is just to get genes into the next generation, by the way, but they do have a purpose. And what the very rough version of my argument is, if Dawkins is conceding, as he kind of is, that you watch an animal mature from egg to animal and go, whoa, that's a hell of an algorithm that generated that thing. You go back to the very beginning, like, what was the algorithm in that egg that generated that? That algorithm would seem to, in some sense, be the product of design. Even if we want to put design in quotes and it's a metaphor and natural selection is a designer, still, Darwinian philosophers like Dan Dennett are comfortable saying, yeah, you can speak of natural selection as designing things, of organisms as having purposes. Okay, so fine. The very rough version of my argument is if you step back and look at the history of life on Earth in time lapse, you see, like, okay, life gets more and more complex, ecosystem develops, several levels of organization are reached, the cell, the complex cell, the multicelled organism, societies of multicelled organisms, and then one of these organisms launches a process that leads to this like giant global brain we're building. If you step back and look at that in time lapse, it actually looks more than you might think like the development of a single organism, as if we are building a superorganism, a planetary superorganism. This is a very rough, crude version of the argument, is that if Dawkins is conceding that certain kinds of objects and processes of development suggest that we need a special explanation, not for how they developed, okay? Because again, Darwinian evolution is the mechanism, okay? It's not about that. It's about how did the algorithm that gave birth to them develop? And in this case, that would mean seeing the first self-replicating material on the planet as, in effect, an algorithm for the creation of a giant global brain. Taking that seriously, okay? That is, very roughly speaking, the argument. It's easy to hear that version of it and dismiss it. I contend that if you keep asking critical questions, more of them have satisfactory answers than you might imagine. But I haven't really developed this into some kind of like book-length argument. The closest comes via the link in that New York Times piece.
Yeah, it's just funny, the whole global brain, one whole organism idea, just very evocative in my mind, at least, of the end of 2001 Space Odyssey, huge kind of baby going back to the beginning after all that progress. But I do want to say that we are reaching time here. And we wanted to firstly thank you for your time. And as a kind of closer, linking this back to AI, geopolitics, evolution even, what do you see maybe as the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for the future?
Well, I guess complete extinction of our species is pretty unlikely because most of the catastrophic scenarios don't wipe out quite every living, breathing human being, and maybe civilization would restore itself and conduct itself more wisely next time around. I'd rather skip that stage and just get to the wisdom. But I certainly can imagine a lot of ways catastrophic things happen. In fact, On the current course, I'd say that, that seems sadly pretty likely. Something of a magnitude, a catastrophe on the scale that certainly at a minimum that people of my generation have never seen. Anyone born after World War II has never seen. And maybe worse, quite possibly worse than that. There's just a lot of things of kinds of threats we're not taking seriously, none of which can be addressed if we don't get kind of the psychology of tribalism, so to speak, under control, which is something that evolution has left us with as a legacy that we have to grapple with. And I apologize to people who are offended by the term tribalism. Call it groupism.
Well, thank you. I think that's a brilliant note to end on. So we're going to wrap up the podcast for today. Listeners, if you're interested by what Bob had to say, please check out his newsletter on Nonzero. It's available on Substack. And Bob, we'd just like to thank you again for the discussion. And that is the Loaf Podcast out.